The grand synod of the Ethelgard hegemony was a place where silence was not merely the absence of sound, but a heavy, velvet physical presence that pressed against the chitinous plates of the assembled delegates. A silence that had been cultivated over 10,000 cycles of absolute, undisputed galactic dominance. The chamber itself was an architectural marvel of grown crystal and suspended gravity fields. A vast, spherical hollow carved into the heart of a rogue moon that had been towed into the orbit of their homeworld. A testament to a civilization that had long ago transcended the petty constraints of planetary geology. Tiers of luminescent podiums floated in the darkened void of the room, arranged in a spiraling helix that ascended toward the vaulted ceiling, where a holographic representation of the galaxy rotated with the slow, majestic indifference of time itself. Usually, this chamber was filled with the polite, subsonic hum of diplomatic discourse, the rhythmic clicking of mandibles signifying agreement, or the soft chiming of light crystals indicating a call to vote. Today, however, the silence was brittle, charged with a frantic, suffocating energy that tasted of ozone and terrified pheromones. Every eye, whether compound, slit-pupilled, or cybernetically enhanced, was fixed upon the central projection, a jagged tier of red light suspended in the center of the room, displaying a sector of space that every chart in the hegemony archives listed as desolate, irrelevant, and dead. High Counselor Vrail, a venerable Ethelgardian whose carapace was frosted with the silver patina of extreme age, gripped the edges of his floating dais, his 4 primary gripping claws digging into the sensory-responsive material hard enough to trigger error warnings on his console. He stared at the data scrolling alongside the red projection, his primary hearts beating a frantic, discordant rhythm against his ribs. The sector in question was designated Null Omicron 9, a region of space located in the frayed edges of the galactic spiral arms, a place where star formation had ceased billions of years ago, and where the fabric of hyperspace was known to be treacherous, riddled with gravitational shoals and magnetic typhoons that could tear a capital ship apart at the molecular level. It was a graveyard of dust and cold gas, a place no sane captain would venture, and certainly not a place where one would expect to find anything other than the quiet entropic decay of the universe. Yet the long-range sensoria arrays, capable of detecting the gravimetric footprint of a single frigate across half a quadrant, were screaming. They were not detecting a frigate. They were not detecting a fleet. They were detecting a singular mass of such impossible density and geometric perfection that the initial automated reports had flagged it as a sensor malfunction. "Verify," Vrail whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of incredulity and a primal, creeping dread that he could not suppress. The word was amplified by the chamber's acoustics, booming like a thunderclap over the assembled heads of the 1,000 vassal species that made up the hegemony. "I said verify the readings. The logic engines must be in error. There is nothing in Null Omicron 9. There has never been anything in Null Omicron 9. The answer came from the pit of the chamber, where the arch-technocrats of the Psi-linked guild hovered in their sensory deprivation tanks, their minds fused directly with the hegemony's central processing core. The voice that replied was a synthesis of 100 minds speaking in unison, a flat, metallic drone devoid of emotion but heavy with undeniable truth. "Verification complete, High Counselor. Diagnostic cycles run 3,000. Probability of sensor error, 0.0. The object is real. Its mass exceeds that of a Class 4 planetary body, yet its displacement suggests a vessel. It is not a natural formation. It is constructed. Its hull composition absorbs 99% of all incident radiation, rendering it visually undetectable to standard optics, but its gravimetric shadow is absolute. It is sitting in the center of the gravitational shear zone. And High Counselor, it is transmitting." A ripple of panicked motion swept through the helix of podiums. Delegates from the warrior castes of the cracks flared their dorsal spines in aggression. The fluid-formed diplomats of the Gellian nebulas retreated into their containment suits, turning a murky, anxious gray. A vessel with the mass of a planet, hidden in the most dangerous sector of the galaxy. The implications were catastrophic. If this was a weapon, the hegemony had no shield capable of withstanding it. If it was an invasion, they were already dead. "Put the transmission on audio," Vrail commanded, forcing his voice to steady itself, though his internal organs felt as though they had turned to ice. "Let us hear the voice of our doom." The static hiss of cosmic backer. Sound radiation filled the chamber for a moment, the sound of the universe breathing before a voice cut through it. It was not the guttural roar of a conqueror, nor the screeching binary of a rogue machine intelligence. It was a voice that sounded frighteningly, confusingly, mundane. It was a voice speaking in a dialect of galactic standard that was archaic, clipped, and calm, underpinned by the subtle, rhythmic thrum of atmosphere recyclers and the faint background chatter of a busy bridge. This is the United Terran vessel Weight of Atlas II? Well, to anyone receiving this on the sublight bands, the voice said, sounding distracted as if the speaker were reading a checklist while holding the microphone. We seem to be picking up faint echoes of a navigation buoy, but our star charts are a bit messy after the jump. We are currently holding position in sector. Look, we're calling it the blind spot. We are conducting critical maintenance. Please advise if we have drifted into a traffic lane. We hate to cause a fender bender with something this size. Also, is this the right sector for the thing? Navigation is arguing with engineering again. Over. Silence returned to the Grand Synod, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of utter bafflement. The terrifying, planet-massed warship that had triggered a Level 1 galactic crisis alert was asking about traffic lanes. It was asking if it was in the right sector, and it had identified itself as Terran. Terran, Vrail breathed, the word tasting strange on his tongue. He searched his memory, accessing the deep archival implants embedded in his cortex. Humans, the bipeds from the Orion Spur, the species that only achieved faster-than-light travel 400 cycles ago, the species we dismissed as mercantile isolationists, the species we deemed inconsequential. They are inconsequential, snapped General Korth of the Cracks, slamming a heavy armored fist onto his podium. They are soft-shelled, emotional, short-lived creatures. They possess no fleets of note. Their empire is a scattering of trade hubs and agri-worlds. This must be a trick, a holographic feint designed to confuse us while a real enemy strikes elsewhere. I demand we deploy the first armada. We must purge this anomaly before it manifests a threat. And if it is not a trick, countered Matriarch Lyssa of the Psionic Coven, her voice projecting directly into the minds of the delegates, soft and chilling. I feel no deception in the voice. I feel weariness. I feel focus. And I feel a power so vast it is like standing at the edge of a black hole. If you send the Armada, General, and that ship is what the sensors say it is, you will be throwing pebbles at a neutron star. We must understand before we strike. We must know why a human ship, a human warship of impossible scale, is sitting in the dark, asking if it is in the right place. The debate raged for hours, a storm of fear and politics that threatened to tear the fragile unity of the hegemony apart. The militarists saw an insult to their sovereignty. The scientists saw a technological singularity that defied physics. The diplomats saw a blunder that could end in extinction. But through it all, the red projection of the anomaly remained, a silent, brooding presence in the heart of the galaxy's most powerful room. The humans were there. They were waiting. And they seemed completely unaware that they had just terrified the masters of the galaxy. Finally, Vrail made the decision. It was a decision born of caution, but also of a deep, nagging curiosity that outweighed his fear. We will not attack, he decreed, silencing the room with a gesture of his claw. Not yet. We will go to them. We will take the Sovereign's will, the flagship of the hegemony. We will bring the Council to this blind spot. We will answer their hail. And we will see with our own eyes what the children of Earth have built in the dark. The journey to Null Omicron 9 was a lesson in humility. The Sovereign's will was a masterpiece of Ethelgardian engineering, a sleek, devastating dreadnought 5 kilometers long, armed with antimatter lances and protected by energetic shielding that could withstand the heart of a star. It traveled through the warp streams with the grace of a predator, slipping between the folds of space-time. But as they approached the coordinates of the anomaly, the smooth ride ended. The warp streams here were turbulent, chopped into frothing chaos by the sheer gravitational mass of the object ahead. The dreadnought shuddered and groaned, its structural integrity fields whining in protest as they were buffeted by waves of distorted gravity. On the bridge of the Sovereign's will, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Vrail stood at the forward observation bay, surrounded by his advisors and the hologram of General Korth. The viewport shutters were retracted, revealing the starfield, but there were no stars here, only the swirling, bruised clouds of cosmic dust and the utter blackness of the void. And then the sensors cleared the interference. "Visual contact," reported the helmsman, his voice cracking, putting it on the main screen. The image that filled the screen stole the breath from Vrail's lungs. It was not a ship in any sense that the hegemony understood. It was a monolith, a slab of matte black metal, rectangular and brutalist, so vast that it blocked out the nebula behind it. It had no elegant curves, no glowing engine nacelles, no visible weapon ports. It looked like a brick thrown by a god. The scale was staggering. It was not merely the size of a planet, it was larger. It stretched for thousands of kilometers, a dark horizon that swallowed the light of the sovereigns will like a gnat flying into a cave. The surface was textured with canyons and mountain ranges of machinery, vast radiator fins that glowed with a dull, sullen red heat, shedding the thermal output of a small star. "By the ancestors," whispered General Korth, his aggression evaporating instantly. That is not a warship, that is a mobile world." "Sensors detect active scanning from the object," the tactician called out. "They have locked on to us. No, wait, they aren't locking weapons, they're hailing us. Audio only." Vrail straightened his robes, trying to summon the dignity of 10,000 years of rule. "Open the channel." The bridge speakers crackled, and the same calm, distracted voice filled the air. "Ah, hello there. We see you've arrived. Sorry about the gravity wake. We're running the stabilizers at 110%, and it tends to make the local spacetime a bit choppy. This is Admiral Ilara Vance of the Weight of Atlas. To whom am I speaking? And more importantly, do you have updated charts for this sector? Our astrogator is convinced we're 3 parsecs off the mark." Vrail cleared his throat. "I am High Counselor Vrail of the Ethelgard Hegemony, ruler of these stars and guardian of the galactic peace. You are in a restricted sector, Admiral Vance, a sector forbidden by ancient law due to its instability. Your presence here is unexpected, and the scale of your vessel is concerning. State your intent." There was a pause on the other end, followed by the sound of shuffling papers and a muffled conversation. "Restricted? Oh, well, that explains the lack of beacons. Look, Counselor, we didn't mean to trespass on your lawn. We're not here for conquest or trade. We're strictly here for the engineering project. We can leave once we're done, but moving this ship is a nightmare of logistics, so we'd really prefer to finish the job first. As for intent, we're just trying to fix the leak." "The leak?" Vrail asked, exchanging a bewildered glance with his science advisor. "What leak?" "The dimensional shear," Vance replied, as if discussing a leaky faucet. "You know, the structural fault in the reality substrate of this sector. We picked up the resonance signals back on Earth about 6 months ago. It looked like the fabric of spacetime was thinning dangerously here. If it ruptures, you're looking at a vacuum collapse that would swallow half the spiral arm. We brought the Atlas to stitch it back up. It's a standard anchor ship. Nothing fancy, just a lot of mass and some localized causality emitters." The bridge of the Sovereign's will was silent. The scientists were frantically checking their readings. One of them, a trembling Jellian, floated up to Vrail. "High Counselor," it burbled, its translation collar vibrating. I am checking the deep-layer physics scans. There is an anomaly, a microscopic fracture in the quantum foam right where the human ship is sitting. It is expanding, if the human ship were not there, applying gravitational pressure. The calculations suggest the Jellian is correct. The sector would unravel." Vrail felt a wave of vertigo. The humans, the young, reckless, upstart humans, had detected a threat that the hegemony, with all its ancient wisdom, had missed. And instead of fleeing, instead of panicking, they had built a ship the size of a moon, flown it into the heart of the danger, and were currently sitting on it to keep it closed. "Admiral Vance," Vrail said, his voice markedly more respectful, "you claim you are repairing reality." "Trying to," Vance sighed. "It's finicky work. We have to thread gravitons through a needle's eye while keeping the ship steady against the chaotic flux. It's why we asked if this was the right sector. The readings were so bad we thought maybe we'd warped into a black hole accretion disk by mistake. But if you say this is Null Omicron 9, then we're in the right spot. Listen, Counselor, since you're here and since you seem to know the neighborhood, we could actually use a hand. Our sensors are struggling to penetrate the static. If you could link your telemetry to ours, it might speed this up. We'd invite you over for coffee and briefing, but, well, the radiation levels on our hull would cook you alive. We're running pretty hot." Vrail looked at the screen, at the terrifying grandeur of the human vessel. He realized then that the panic the hegemony had felt was the panic of an ant realizing it was standing next to a giant who was busy holding up the sky. The humans weren't underestimated because they were weak. They were underestimated because they played a game so different from the rest of the galaxy that the hegemony hadn't even recognized the board. "We will assist," Vrail said, the decision coming from a place of instinct. "We will transfer our data, and Admiral, I request permission to come aboard. I must see this. My shuttle has shielding sufficient for short-term exposure." There was a long silence, then a chuckle. "All right, Counselor, if you're brave enough, docking bay 4 is cleared. Watch your step. The gravity is heavy." The shuttle ride to the Weight of Atlas was a journey into the mouth of a beast. As Vrail and a small entourage of guards and scientists approached the hull, the sheer detail of the human engineering became visible. The surface was a fractal landscape of pipes, conduits, and heat exchangers, all built with a brutal industrial aesthetic that prioritized function over form. There were no sleek lines, no artistic flourishes. It was a machine built for a singular, desperate purpose. They docked in a cavernous bay that smelled of ozone, machine oil, and old coffee. The airlock cycled with a heavy mechanical clank, and the inner doors ground open to reveal a reception committee. They were not soldiers in power armor, nor diplomats in silk. They were engineers in stained jumpsuits, technicians with heavy augmentation goggles, and in the center, a woman who looked far too small to command a ship of this magnitude. Admiral Alara Vance was a woman of perhaps 60 Terran years, her hair a steel-gray mane tied back in a severe bun. She wore a simple naval uniform, unadorned save for a few rank pips. Her face was lined with exhaustion, but her eyes were sharp, calculating, and surprisingly kind. "Welcome to the Atlas," she said, extending a hand, a primitive, tactile greeting. Vrail hesitated, then extended a claw to grasp it. Her grip was firm. "Sorry about the mess. We've been running double shifts for 3 weeks. Reality doesn't like being stitched, and it fights back." "Admiral," Vrail said, bowing his head slightly. "Your vessel, it is overwhelming. The hegemony has nothing like it." "I should hope not," Vance said, leading them down a wide corridor lined with thick cabling. The floor vibrated with a deep, subsonic thrum that rattled Vrail's teeth. "This isn't a ship you build because you want to. It's a ship you build because you have to. We call it a siege engine, but the enemy isn't a fleet. It's entropy." As they walked, Vance explained. The humans, it seemed, had discovered early on that their region of space was prone to these tears. They hadn't expanded their empire outward because they were too busy fortifying their home. They had turned their entire civilization into a maintenance crew for the local cluster. While the hegemony played at war and politics, humanity had been quietly reinforcing the basement of the galaxy. They reached the Command Information Center, CIC, a room that looked less like a bridge and more like a stock exchange floor during a crash. Hundreds of humans were shouting data, running between consoles and manipulating holographic schematics of the dimensional fault. In the center of the room was a massive pit where a 3D representation of the tier swirled, a chaotic vortex of red and black. "Status," Vance barked as she stepped up to the central table. "It's fluctuating, Admiral," a young officer replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "The anchor beams are holding, but the shear stress is increasing. We're seeing feedback loops in the emitter arrays. If we don't stabilize the localized constant within the hour, the tier is going to widen. And if it widens, the Atlas might get pulled in." Vance nodded, her face grim. She turned to Vrail. "This is the problem, Counselor. We have the mass to hold the door open and the tech to sew it shut, but we're lacking the processing power to predict the fluctuations in real time. Our computers are fast, but they're not intuitive. We need something that can feel the warp currents." Vrail looked at the swirling vortex. He felt the psionic matriarch Lissa's presence in his mind, sensing the terror and the awe of the humans. "We can help," Vrail said. "The Jellian navigators, they perceive hyperspace not as math but as music. They can predict the currents, and the hegemony's central core, it has the processing power you lack." Vance looked at him, surprise registering on her face. "You de-link your network to ours? That's a massive security risk for you. We could download your entire database. And you could let the galaxy be swallowed." "Load by the void," Vrail countered. "I believe the risk is acceptable. Besides, Admiral, if you wanted to conquer us, you would have just parked this ship in orbit of our homeworld and turned on the gravity." Vance smiled, a dry, humorless twitch of the lips. "Fair point. All right, get your people plugged in. Let's save the universe." The next hour was a blur of frantic cooperation. Hegemony scientists worked side by side with human engineers, bridging incompatible technologies with frantic patches and jury-rigged adapters. The Jellian navigators were brought aboard, floating in their containment tanks, their minds reaching out into the roiling chaos of the tier. They sang the song of the warp to the human computers, and the Atlas responded. The ship groaned. The floor tilted as the artificial gravity compensators struggled to keep up with the shifting mass. Outside, the massive radiator fins flared white-hot, dumping exaduals of energy into space. The Stitcher beams, massive lances of focused causality, intensified, turning from blue to a blinding violet. "Holding steady," the officer yelled over the roar of the power plant. Fluctuation is damping, the tier is sealing. Push it, Vance ordered, her hands gripping the rail of the command pit. All reactors to maximum, don't let it slip. For a moment, it seemed like it would work. The red vortex began to shrink, the edges knitting together as the Atlas poured its impossible weight onto the wound in reality. But then, a siren screamed, a sound that cut through the noise of the room like a knife. "Admiral, new contact," the tactical officer screamed. "Coming through the tier, something is pushing back." The room froze. On the main screen, the shrinking vortex suddenly bulged outward. Something was trying to emerge. It was not a ship. It was a shape, a geometry that hurt the eyes to look at, a writhing mass of impossible angles and dark light. "It's not just a tier," Vance whispered, her face draining of color. "It's a door." Vrail stared in horror. "What is that?" "We don't know," Vance said, her voice dropping to a calm, terrifying monotone. "We've seen echoes of them before, entities from the bulk space outside our universe. They feed on high-energy gradients. They're trying to widen the breach to get in." The entity pushed harder. The Atlas shuddered violently, metal screaming as the hull plates buckled. "We're losing containment," the officer reported. "The entity is anchoring itself to our gravity well. It's using us to pull itself through." Vance turned to Vrail. "Counselor, you need to leave. Now take your shuttle. Get the Sovereign's will to a safe distance." "What will you do?" Vrail asked, though he feared the answer. "We're the plug," Vance said simply. "If we can't stitch it shut, we have to block it. We're going to initiate a core overload in the drive section. We're going to detonate the ship." "That will kill you all," Vrail said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Thousands of you." 11,420, Vance corrected. "But it will collapse the local gravity well and seal the breach permanently. It's the protocol. Why do you think we built the ship this big? It's not just a tool, it's a bullet." Vrail looked at the humans around the room. They were terrified. Some were crying. But not one of them was leaving their post. They were typing commands, routing power, preparing to die with a stoicism that shamed the warrior castes of the hegemony. These short-lived, fragile creatures were willing to burn themselves out of existence to save a galaxy that didn't even know they existed. "No," Vrail said. Vance blinked. "Excuse me." "I said no," Vrail said, his voice rising. He tapped his communicator. "General Korth, are you receiving?" "I am here, High Counselor," Korth's voice growled over the link. "We are monitoring. The energy spike is off the charts." "The humans are attempting to sacrifice themselves to seal the breach," Vrail said. "They lack the energy to push the entity back, so they are using their lives as reaction mass. This is unacceptable." "Agreed," Korth said, and for the first time there was respect in the Crack's general's voice. "A warrior does not let an ally die alone." "Ally?" Vance asked, looking between Vrail and the comms unit. "You asked if this was the right sector," Vrail said, drawing himself up to his full height. "You asked if you were alone. You are not. General Korth, bring the fleet in. All ships. Target the entity. Link fire control to the human-designated Vance. Pour everything we have into that tier." "With pleasure," Korth replied. Space around the weight of Atlas suddenly lit up as the hegemony fleet dropped out of warp, disregarding the safety protocols. Hundreds of ships, cruisers, destroyers, dreadnoughts, formed a phalanx around the massive human vessel. They were tiny compared to the Atlas, but they were many. "Admiral," Vrail said, "you provide the anchor, we will VD the fire." Vance looked at the tactical display, seeing the swarm of alien ships appearing on her screens. She looked at Vrail, and for a moment the mask of the stoic commander slipped, revealing a profound relief. "All hands," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "Belay the overload, retarget main emitters to focus the hegemony barrage. Let's knock this thing back to hell." The battle that followed was silent in the void, but blindingly bright. The hegemony fleet unleashed a torrent of antimatter, plasma, and kinetic rounds, a river of fire that flowed over the hull of the Atlas and into the tier. The human ship acted as a lens, focusing the chaotic energy of the fleet into a cohesive beam of white-hot rejection. The entity writhed, its impossible geometry fracturing under the assault. It shrieked, a psychic scream that was felt by every mind in the system, and then with a final, violent spasm it was banished. The pressure vanished. "Now," Vance yelled, "seal it." The Atlas fired its Stitcher beams. The tier, weakened and devoid of the entity's resistance, collapsed. The red light faded, replaced by the comforting, empty black of normal space. The sensors flatlined. The tear was gone. Silence returned to the CIC. It was broken only by the heavy breathing of the crew and the groaning of the ship's cooling metal. Vance slumped against the table, wiping her face. She looked at Vrail. "Nice shooting, counselor. You guys pack a punch." Vrail looked at the screen, at the fleet of his people floating alongside the bruised giant of the human ship. "And you, Admiral? You hold the line. We thought you were a threat. We thought you were conquerors." "We're just the janitors, Vrail," Vance said, pulling a flask from her pocket and taking a swig. "Someone has to clean up the mess." The aftermath of the blind spot incident changed the galaxy, though not in the way the politicians had feared. There was no war. There was no invasion. Instead, there was a quiet, terrified understanding. The Ethelgard hegemony realized that while they had been building empires, the humans had been building walls to keep out the dark. The weight of Atlas remained in the sector for another month, undergoing repairs. Vrail stayed aboard for much of that time, learning about humanity. He learned that they were a species defined by their vulnerability. They knew they were small. They knew the universe was hostile. And so they had decided that if the universe wouldn't protect them, they would protect the universe. The panic that had started the encounter became a grim joke in the High Council. They had panicked because a human warship was in the wrong sector. They eventually learned the truth. A human warship is never in the wrong sector. If a human warship is there, it is because that is exactly where the disaster is about to happen. On the day of the Atlas's departure, Vrail stood on the observation deck of the Sovereign's Will. The massive human ship was powering up its drive, the space around it rippling with gravitational potential. "This is weight of Atlas to Sovereign's Will," Vance's voice came over the comms. "Thanks for the assist. We're heading out. Sensors picked up another stress fracture in Sector 7G, probably nothing as bad as this, but better safe than sorry." "Admiral," Vrail said, "the hegemony. We would like to send a flotilla with you to assist. We have realized that perhaps we have been looking inward for too long." There was a pause. "We'd appreciate the company, counselor. It gets lonely in the dark. Atlas out." The massive black brick of a ship vanished, folding space around itself and disappearing into the void. Vrail watched it go, a strange sense of comfort settling over him. The galaxy was old, and it was dangerous, and it was full of horrors. But as he looked at the empty space where the humans had been, he realized that for the first time in 10,000 years, he wasn't afraid of the dark. He knew the janitors were on shift. But as the Atlas disappeared, a final packet of data was transmitted to Vrail's personal console. It was encrypted, flagged for his eyes only. He opened it, expecting a diplomatic pleasantry. Instead, it was a sensor log, a long-range scan taken by the Atlas just before the entity had tried to break through. It showed the entity's origin point, deep in the extra-universal bulk. There wasn't just one entity. The scan showed a swarm, billions of them, waiting, pressing against the skin of the universe, and in the center of the swarm, a signal was pulsing, a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the galaxy. Vrail stared at the screen, the cold dread returning, heavier than before. The humans hadn't just been sealing a leak. They were boarding up a window before a hurricane. The right sector wasn't a mistake. It was the front line, and the war hadn't even started yet. Vrail turned to his comms officer. "Signal the High Council," he said, his voice steel. "Tell them to double the fleet production. Tell them to wake the sleepers." "High Counselor," the officer asked, confused. "The crisis is over." "No," Vrail said, looking out into the eternal night. "The humans just bought us time, and we are not going to waste it." The silence of the Grand Synod would never be the same again. The age of arrogance was over. The age of survival had begun. And somewhere in the dark, the weight of Atlas was already looking for the next crack in the wall.